Good morning. Good morning. There we go. That's much better. Well, I'm Stephen Bonner. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and I spent about 20 years working in industry, often sitting across the table from regulators, trying to explain at great depth how what had happened wasn't my fault and it was all fine. And then I had the fortune of moving about 6 years ago into the consulting world, where I get to hold the hands of people sitting across the table from the regulators, trying to explain it's not their fault. So today I'll be sharing some of that experience and some of my predictions for in the future. I'm joined today with Nick.
And I'm Nick Seaver. I've spent just over 20 years working for Deloitte. I'm focusing entirely on cybersecurity consulting and financial services. So generally when I'm sitting with clients, it's when the regulators are beginning to get grumpy and they are beginning to need help.
And we do have a microphone today for your questions. I will be throwing this into the audience. I'm told it's soft and doesn't hurt, but I've not experienced it, so good luck. But if you have a question on the way, stick your hand up. We'll throw you the mic and then everyone can be able to hear you. We should have a bit of time for questions at the end, but we absolutely want questions on the way through. And I'll throw it gently, I promise. So our first kind of question is, obviously both Nick and I focus on financial services. So there's a proportion of the audience going, well, why on earth am I here then? I'm not interested in the regulation of financial services. If you are thinking that, please stay till I finish this explanation rather than just get up and walk out now. The reason we think what's happening in financial services is still relevant to everybody is we think financial services is the canary in the coal mine. And obviously my great experience of coal mining, as you can tell from my suitable stature to be working underground, I know a lot about coal mines. But what we see is what regulation starts in financial services then ends up being copied in other industries. It's a very heavily regulated industry, but it's not the only regulated industry. And a lot of the things we're seeing starting to be developed in financial services around the management of cyber risk, we expect to fully see be implemented in other industries. And as we talk through, we'll touch on some of the ways we've seen that happening. So even if you're not an FS person, it's still hopefully going to be an interesting and relevant discussion we're going to have today. Okay? Then let's dive in. Nick, can you tell us what's been sort of going on in the industry over the last year or so?
So I think over the last year or so in FS, I mean, there's resignation amongst users and customers that banks and other FS organisations can lose data from time to time. And I think that's sort of well understood and been worried about for very many years. What is coming hugely into focus and has done over the last 2 years is the concern about the loss of integrity of data or the loss of availability of systems in a way you can't get it back quickly. So this has really moved 10 years ago from we're really worried we might lose some customer data to everyone kind of gets that. Now we're really worried what happens if we lose systems and stuff. And it'd be fair to say I think there is in financial services there's a raft of different regulators. There are 2 in the UK. There are some pretty aggressive ones in the States, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, other jurisdictions, and there is a level of copying each other on regulation. There's a level of gold-plating each other's regulation. But for a big global bank or insurance company, they tend to have to comply with lots of different regulators, all with some level of extraterritorial regulation, and all with some level of what you need to do is X, unless another regulator makes you do Y, in which case you need to do X and Y, which is quite complicated if you're regulated in many, many places. So some of the things that, and those of you in financial services will have known some of this, but to greater or less extent people have been struggling with this year are encryption of static data. So lots of people have encrypted data in transit, but data at rest that's personally identifiable or sensitive, there's some level of regulatory pressure for some level of risk analysis and encryption around that, which is causing quite a lot of headaches if you've got a 30, 40, 50 million customer base. Cybersecurity culture is being talked about a lot. So the old adage, it's not just IT, etc., but have you got a good cybersecurity culture? What does that mean? Well, we'll know if we see it, but we can't tell you what it means. So, but it's a real struggle because you have to demonstrate this stuff, right? And you're demonstrating something that no one can tell you quite how to demonstrate it or what it means, but they know when you haven't got it and will criticize it. Key asset identification. So what are your key assets? Is that data? Is that systems? Is that applications? Is that locations? But there's an expectation that you have your key assets identified. You have your key assets understood from an inherent and a residual risk perspective in confidentiality, integrity and availability terms, and you have a prioritization plan to fix that stuff. Now, anyone who works in a major international company knows that the chance of you knowing how many applications you have and exactly where they are and how they're configured is pretty low. Knowing where all your key data sets and assets are is even harder, but it's an expectation. And then breach reporting. So in financial services, breach reporting is becoming increasingly complex. Different regulators have different views on it, but generally most regulators expect you to report a breach once discovered in a fairly short time frame. So, I mean, to give an example of this stuff, the DFS, so the New York Department of Financial Services, states that each firm shall notify the superintendent as promptly as possible, but in no event later than 72 hours in the determination that a cybersecurity event has occurred. Kind of seems reasonable. Cybersecurity events have a reasonable likelihood of harming any material part of normal operations. Kind of seems reasonable. And then the killer line, cybersecurity events of which notices is required to be provided to any government body, self-regulating agency, or any other supervisory body. So now we've got a New York set of laws that says you need to follow our law unless there's another law or regulation anywhere in the world that you're required to follow, in which case you need to follow that as well and tell us in line with that. And then you start looking halfway across the world and you see Singapore. A financial institution must notify the authority as soon as possible, but in no event later than 1 hour of having discovered a breach. So while that seems unreasonable from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, some might say, actually, New York expects you, if you're regulated in Singapore, to tell them in the same time frame. So not only have you got a bunch of relatively challenging legislation to comply with, but you've also got, in some legislation, it basically says brackets, unless another regulator has a higher standard, in which case you must match that too, which makes it pretty impossible. And then breach reporting, also recovery plans. So, if you lose your core banking system or your core insurance writing system, it's going to take you a few days to recover. Doesn't matter. The regulator expects you to do it. The regulator expects you to do it in a time frame that is almost impossible to do. And the regulators will generally say, what is your average outage time when you have an incident? And that tends to increase over time because you fix your systems so that minor problems that knock you out for half an hour don't happen anymore because you engineer those out. Then by definition, the fewer incidents you have are more complicated, take more time to diagnose and take longer. So your outage per incident goes up and people are getting kind of hammered by that. And I would say a lack of understanding with some regulators is if you engineer out the simple problems, then your average downtime will be higher when you do have a problem. So this is this year. And then many of you will have seen some of the penetration testing programs, so CBEST in the UK, for example. But those things will all gather heat as well. And then just a nice little kicker for those of you who are struggling with resources. And many regulators are doing this, but the New York DFS, Department of Financial Services, state that you must validate that you have the adequate resources to deal with your cyber challenges and your cyber problems. Now, anybody who's sitting in a big organisation here might have some level of supply-demand imbalance in cyber resources, but still that's something you will need to be certifying. So that's kind of just where we are now. That's 2017, and that's the thing that many organisations Stephen and I work with have been, and many of you, I guess, have been struggling through. So.
And the biggie for this year is GDPR. And we've got, I think it's 15 days left to go, working days. You get another 6 if you work weekends, and there is a bank holiday, so there's plenty of time. There's nothing to worry about. I was talking to a client and I said there are 2 things. If you work in the information security space, there's 2 things you need to do in the remaining time for GDPR. Number 1 is plan a party for GDPR to say thank you to all the people in privacy who've been doing all the hard work. That's about all there's time left to do, is plan a good party. And the other thing to do is find someone in privacy and ask them, is there anything I need to do for the GDPR regulations? They love it. They love it. You say that to a privacy person, they're delighted with you for days about that. But there are perhaps some slightly more serious things to start thinking about after the deadline. There's been a lot of focus in a lot of organizations about putting in manual solutions or quick fixes to get to a good position for the start of this process. But there isn't necessarily the level of preparation for getting a sustainable long-term view. And as we're talking today about regulations, I want to draw out for me, there are sort of 3 key areas that are likely to attract attention of the regulator in this topic. They don't all directly relate to IT security, but there's definitely a link in many of them. And the 3, I like to call them the 3 C's. And for me, they are crisis, complaints, and crusaders. A crisis is fairly obvious. If you have a massive data breach, or you accidentally sell 87 million people's worth of data, then the regulator is going to pay attention. And you're thinking, that's brilliant advice, Stephen, thank you. We were planning a crisis, but now you've warned us it might be bad. We'll cancel that and everything will be easier. Yes, clearly there isn't always control over when you have a crisis, but quite often the cause of these crises are cybersecurity incidents. It is the data loss, it is the failure of encryption, it is the even the SQL injection left on an external web server that causes these issues. So it is worth engaging as security people with your privacy team to help them understand where your core risks lie so they can prepare for these kind of crises, because a good response makes a huge difference around the crisis. But it's not just a crisis. The other thing that I see that absolutely attracts regulatory attention is pockets of complaints. They don't have necessarily enough resource to cover everyone all the time, but if customers of your organization are raising complaints to the privacy regulator, they will pay attention. And one of the things is, because they don't have time to really understand every organization, they will draw on conclusions based on the volume and nature of complaints. So it could be, by chance, a couple of entirely separate parts of your organization have an issue that gets escalated to the regulator, but their conclusion will be you have a systemic problem across all your organization. So making sure that you can manage complaints very well is very important. And there are two key sources, when you look at what drives the regulator, the two key sources of complaints are, number one, around late subject access requests, and number two is around unsolicited email and text, spam, basically. Now, as security people, quite often you've run programs to, say, ensure PCI compliance by scanning the network and identifying unstructured data. Or you might be mapping and building an inventory of internal systems to make sure you've got the right risk approach to managing it. And in the case here, you can really help the privacy people by helping them know where to look to find the personal data when there are these subject access requests. And helping them shorten that time will absolutely reduce the likelihood of you getting complaints, which will absolutely reduce the likelihood of getting attention. Now, of course, this does rely on the fact that fundamentally things are okay and it's just the delays are causing an issue. You've got a whole separate set of advice, but I know you're all very diligent organizations and fundamentally everything is fine, so it's important to get this bit part. And the other one is around spam. Quite often, it's the security team who are helping deflect, understand and manage unsolicited emails coming in. That level of expertise and knowledge can be applied to the emails going out from your organization, and getting engaged to make sure the marketing organizations or the in-house teams you're using to communicate with customers are following the best security practice you would expect to receive emails coming in can be a useful value add to help these people. And the last area is crusaders. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about the privacy world, is because, for instance, there are regulators who don't pay particularly well. I know they've got approval just recently to step off civil service pay scales in an attempt to attract more and more people. But what I've found it's meant is the people left in the regulator and who really care about privacy really care about privacy. There are some other regulators where they see it as an important career, a useful thing to do, a good bit of experience on the CV. But in the regulators where they don't have sufficient resources, they are true believers. And the sort of challenge around true believers is they're surrounded by other true believers. And these crusaders, they will go out and try and find privacy problems in the world, draw attention to them, with a good heart to try and improve things and make things better. But this means particularly those parts of your privacy program that is externally exposed. The notices you're providing to people, the privacy policy you publish, the boxes you use to gather consent, these are visible to the whole internet. And if they haven't been updated or they contain deeply inaccurate advice, it is possible that a crusading organization will scan, say, a particular industry and then produce a league table of who has got the best privacy notices and who has the worst. You do not want to be in the worst section of those kind of campaign organizations, because absolutely the regulators pay attention to that and take steps to address those who are at the bottom and be on the top of that list. Now, often, as security people, you will have a good inventory, one hopes if you're doing security right, of your external-facing websites. You'll have... Oh, yeah. I could take the laugh around all banks couldn't get everything back in 2 days if everything went wrong. That was kind of a suitable critique. But surely asset management... Anyway, okay. I'm normally the one heckling. I'm thrown now. Completely ruined. So you have a good sense of your web environment. You're probably scanning it for things. You may be able to extend that scanning to identify key privacy notices and make sure they are being updated in a timely manner, and find the old stuff and turn it off. This is a great opportunity to... it's great when the heckles come from my co-presenter rather than the audience. And there are a few other trends kind of coming slightly longer term. So those are the three you can do kind of to get ready in the next 6 months as the regulators spin up and we start seeing some action. But it's not just the regulators, or there are some interesting other things coming. The regulator has laid out a technology strategy and highlights 3 key areas in the medium term they're going to be focusing on around privacy. And that's cybersecurity, so good for us. That's AI and machine learning, and it is device tracking, the sort of multi-device ultrasonic beacons, all that kind of great stuff. They're the three areas they're going to be looking at, so good overlap with our profession. But they're also, one of those things, they're setting up a regulatory sandbox so that organizations doing things that might be, I was going to say questionable, but that's a bit judgmental, things that are innovative. You're doing disruptive things with privacy or data. You can engage with them to practice in a safe way so both sides can learn whether it's safe or not. So good to engage and drive on that. And the final thing, and probably the most important thing, is within the new regulation, there's a much more of a sense of the possibility of class actions. There's still a little bit of debate going on about how the UK version that will carry on post-Brexit does this, but certainly for the GDPR, there's the ability for groups of people to come together and follow up driving their own legal challenge rather than relying on the regulators. In an environment where the regulators have limited resources, this could be a big and important change. So making sure that your organization is thinking about how the reputation you have is more likely or less likely to attract that kind of group action by your customers or potentially even your employees.
And while GDPR is just about finished, there's going to be loads of resources free to concentrate on other regulatory stuff. 72% of FSB, so FSB is the Financial Stability Board. It's basically a group of the G20 countries plus 7 or 8 other countries. But 72% of the Financial Stability Board members, so this is primarily regulators in big countries, will release new cyber standards or initiatives this year, 2018. And if you're a bank or an insurance company in a number of different G20 countries, you can be pretty much 99% sure that new regulation is coming that will hit you. So some of the things that are conversations at this point for us, but we think are coming down the pipe and kind of having more and more conversations about are regulators are worried about bank stability. So if you lose your systems, how do you get money into your customers' pockets, and how much liquidity have you got, and how long will it be before you get your systems up, and do you have sufficient liquidity reserves to keep your bank alive while your systems are down, is becoming a topic of conversation. And in non-banking world, that's how long will your systems be down for, and how much cash have you got access to, and how long can you run before you properly run out of cash? And the answer is normally weeks, not months on that stuff. So that stability piece is becoming very topical. System-wide risks, payment systems, clearing systems, interbank risks. Steve might be there to lend me money if I lose all my systems, but if he loses all his systems, etc. So that's becoming really topical. Risk quantification. What's your inherent risk? What's your risk appetite? What's your residual risk? So we've all had, or lots of us have seen variants of that conversation. It's been quite, if I'm generous, it's been quite qualitative. If I'm less generous, it's been somewhat unscientific. I think there's a mounting expectation of the next 3 or 4 years that will become more scientific, and you will actually have to quantify your residual risk exposure for cyber by asset, etc. So lots of people are beginning to try and work out how they might do that. There's no right answer to this yet. I think it's very much an emerging topic, but the actual quantification of cyber risk is, in my view, becoming more and more topical. And you've also got that interplaying with regulators in some jurisdictions who are expecting the board to sign this off and have an intelligent conversation about it. And trying to explain to a board that you've modelled cyber risk based on critical assets using credit risk type methodologies and loss given deep, it just gets very hard. Cloud is becoming very topical. I mean, everyone's talking about cloud, but in financial services specifically, there's a level of concern building that there's cloud creates a level of concentration risk potentially that is higher than the concentration risk that existed pre-cloud, and therefore, how do banks manage that concentration risk? So if a big cloud provider has a material problem and all the banks have put something big into that core cloud provider, then you've got a system-wide problem. So there's a lot of effort in people trying to work out how you govern that and how you get assurance over that rather than just rely on third-party providers, and then how you tell people. And the defence that, well, we're all at risk because we all run the same mainframe systems anyway today, so it's no different. It doesn't really cut it very well. Other things, rationale. So why did you do this thing? Why did you do X instead of Y? Why did you choose Control A instead of Control B? So an actual ability to justify that stuff when a regulator or an investigation comes along later and looks at stuff is getting there. And I think the dial on culture is going up, right? You see, well, many of us have seen the speeches and stuff, but it's not just an IT problem. The board should be involved, all of that stuff. But the dial on how do you demonstrate that you've got a cyber-aware and security-aware culture is slowly turning up with no real answers as to how you actually do that and how you effectively do that? It's a bit of a dark art, really. And then one thing I think that absolutely we've had a shift to is cyber has moved to being considered by regulators to be almost an inevitability that you've got to plan for, and therefore a lot more focus on, if you have an event, not only how much cash you have or how much liquidity you have, depending on your industry, but also what are the critical assets you need to get up and running again, and how do you start to get up, bootstrap your organization back up if you lose your core systems, etc. Which
I'm going to delve into that a little bit further. So yes, when I was back in industry, the sort of running at a large bank, my main sort of threats were organised crime and potentially, if I was having a particularly bad day, some kind of nation that wanted to steal data to spy on people. And the advantage of both of those is they're parasites, not predators. Neither of them are actually interested in destroying the bank. They want the bank to keep going so they can siphon money off, or they can spy on what data is being held by the organisation. Now, occasionally, yes, absolutely, some parasites feed a little bit too much, and that causes a problem for the institution from losing too much money. But fundamentally, that was the world we lived in. And much of the regulation was designed to make sure that I was treating customers fairly and making sure their money was returned promptly if there was a money loss, and that I had sufficient resources to survive in the face of these kind of attacks. But over the last year, there's been a couple of trends that have sort of come together to change that sort of calculation. We've seen the rise of ransomware, and particularly much of the sort of initial ransomware was very much a sort of B2C business, aiming at retail customers and saying, you've got some wedding photos, give me 50 quid to get them back. But as you'd expect, not because of advice we've provided to them, but like any good organised crime, they obviously have consultants who advise them about how they should diversify their market, and they're moving on from just retail to looking at B2b ransomware. Well, they'll find organisations, particularly it started generally with hospitals as being the first target, because their data is very valuable and needed in a generally very time-sensitive way. But this is ransomware that sort of basically turns up and says, look, it's a very nice hospital, very nice bank you've got here. Wouldn't it be a shame if it all disappeared? Send us some money or we'll wipe everything. And that kind of having someone motivated to actually destroy rather than just feed off a little bit is a change. And we've also seen a step up in how nations are operating. Not satisfied with just spying on everybody, they now want to throw cyber into the mix as an escalating method of applying political pressure to each other. So they want to start destroying little bits of critical infrastructure to show that they can and apply pressure. And this has meant, in some of the incidents we saw last year, major well, to be fact, a fairly random selection of bits of industry were hit. I do think there's something quite telling that FS didn't have an incident around that. Those big issues did not materially affect financial services organisations. And if you ask, I know we have a sort of mix in the audience, if you ask financial services, that's because, oh, well, we're just better, that's why. And you then sort of try and delve into that. They don't really have a good answer in what way they're better or how it happened. So I'm not sure if that was fluke, but it's one to reflect on. But because absolutely the regulators can see this rising tide of potentially substantially impactful events, not an outage on one application, but everything is gone. And they're starting to make a lot of noise about, well, you should have backups sufficient that you don't have to pay any ransom, that you can recover from that. The Stability Board in the US is actually building a process for financial services where they actually build a process where they can share customer data, so that if one organization was completely wiped, those customers can be served by another major bank. So that way, stability retains and no one is too worried. But we're seeing an absolute push because, as Nick brought out, it's a bit different. Most of the resilience work people have done to date has been about making sure that data center A sends its data within milliseconds to data center B and can continue. Now, the problem if you're hit by ransomware or someone trying to disrupt your organization, you are copying their malware within milliseconds to your secondary data center, which does not provide particularly high levels of resilience. You are, good consistency across your environment. Everything is wiped, not just a few key pieces. And having helped having our team helped several organizations who were hit by some of these wiping organizations, there are a few lessons learned that are worth reflecting on for a moment. One of the organizations had extensive backups, but unfortunately the backup software and the license keys to operate the backup software were held in those backups. So when the backup software and the license keys to operate the backup were wiped, they had no way of accessing the backups which had the backup software in. And they hadn't really thought about, in their critical recovery plans, they were all focused on front-facing business services. If it was an hour outage, it would significantly disrupt their business. They hadn't thought about those key infrastructure components that were required to rebuild things. It's quite a different set of things you need. They hadn't stored the laptop build in a safe place, because they'd always assumed, if the key data center goes down, of course we'll all have laptops. They hadn't thought about a world where that went away. So we're seeing a focus on understanding what data you have that you would need to recover, rather than what data you have to continue operations. Bit of a sort of change of thought there. And then we're seeing a lot of interest from regulators asking, okay, well, you've got your core front-facing systems. They're likely to be infected, or they're asking, prove to us they never can be. And if you can prove that, please apply for a job, because we'll definitely hire you if you have a way of proving you're immune to malware. That seems a bit of a stretch for the industry at the moment, but if you can, definitely interested in talking. And if you can't prove that, then they're asking, okay, how do you know the backups are safe? What have you done to make sure those backups are immutable or protected? We're seeing a lot of interest around that. What do you need to recover? How do you keep it safe? And they're also starting to ask, have you practiced this? Have you tried recovering? Have you rebuilt Active Directory from scratch? Because that's hard. And it's particularly hard if you don't have any of the software, any of the settings. But even if you have the software and settings, that's a difficult thing to do. But if you practice it a few times, it gets a lot easier. So all those things that the sort of older faces in the room like myself will remember, battle boxes, offline data sets, these are coming back, because the great work we did to build resilient systems were resilient in the face of accidents. They're resilient in the face of software failure, and software failure has got less likely. So those kind of experience of recovering from big failures is getting lost in the industry. But we're going to see a rise of these big failures, and regulators are definitely keen to make sure that organizations don't take a comfortable view of worrying about it later. They want to know what's being done to protect against this threat. And that's a very key focus on critical infrastructure, but I think it'll spread into other areas as these kind of attacks continue to exist.
And who's going to get blamed when this all goes wrong? Well, look, in seriousness, I think the regulators absolutely get that this stuff happens, but when it does happen, they're going to look to see what decisions people made and whether they made the right decisions. There are a couple of things here. The CISO and the CSO are becoming recognized senior positions with a level of responsibility around this stuff. So the UK Financial Services Senior Manager regime, the New York DFS recognizes those as responsible people. And that's not to say it's a terrible place to be, but it's a place where if you're making a material decision about something about cyber, in the cold light of day, in retrospect, if something goes wrong, you need to be able to explain why that was probably the sensible decision to make with the facts you had to hand, etc. So there's a level of, I guess, discipline of recording that stuff and meeting minutes and so on that probably is much higher than it was 3 or 4 years ago in financial services, and that is, in my view, going to spread to other industries. The other piece here is, I know everyone says it's not IT, it's the board, but it really is the board in many cases. So Tiber, which I'll talk about a bit later, the EU kind of intelligence-led testing scheme, puts specific board responsibilities on this stuff. There's specific expectations with the regulators in the UK, Hong Kong, Singapore around a board challenge and oversight of cyber. And what that means in practice is boards need to be able to demonstrate that they had access to sufficient cyber skills. So they either need to have a cyber literacy on the board, which some take the approach of, or they should, in big organizations, have access to appropriate independent cyber skills in the organization. So the reality is, in many organizations, that's an advisory committee that advises the risk committee of the board or the main board itself. But broadly, the accountability is very much getting levelled at both the board and specifically the CISO, which is becoming a very recognised role in many jurisdictions for this stuff.
And part of that accountability is accountability to securities regulators. So there's been this interesting topic that if you're aware or have had a security incident and haven't told your shareholders about it, then you're defrauding the shareholders because they had a right to know. And this is leading to quite a big change in how organizations are disclosing incidents. There's a case working its way through, I think they've picked up the fine, but there was a case working through where they sort of put in their disclosures, well, it might happen that we have a terrible security incident where all our data is stolen and abused and our customers are harmed. And it turned out they had a major incident in which their data was abused. And it's sort of, well, I mean, I guess you could say it might happen, but if you actually know it has happened, that's kind of, you're playing on the edge. And what we've seen is an enormous change in how organizations choose to disclose. It is clear that, as in so many things, it's the cover-up that gets you, not the incident. if you're clear and straightforward with it, engage with people and tell them what's happened, you can actually build trust because they can see the controls you had, or at least that you've taken responsibility for it and are fixing it. If you try and hide it and then later it comes out, immediately they are suspicious and do not believe what you are telling. And we're seeing a huge change. Now, there's always a cheesy bit in one of my presentations where I pimp our kind of some interesting content. I think it's all in your bags you got this morning, so you've probably already discarded it without looking at it. But if you get the chance, you can come and pick it up and have a look. This is our analysis of the last few years of the FTSE 100 boards and what they've disclosed in their annual reports. And it's quite fascinating. This year, 99, I think for our risk people, I'm not allowed to say numbers, I have to say percentages. So 99%, you'll never guess how many members of the FTSE 100 that is, but 99% of the FTSE 100 released, mentioned cyber somewhere in their annual report. There's one. I'm going to get that one next year. We're going to get it to 100%. But for now, 99% of the FTSE 100. It just shows how the topic we focus on has actually become, top tier kind of information. And within those, we see quite a lot of different things. So this year, I'm sort of comparing this year with last year to see some trends. This year, 89% of the FTSE 100 mentioned cyber as a principal risk, up from about 87% last year. 53% of the FTSE 100 think the risk is increasing year on year, which is quite an interesting, I think. Last year it was 64%. And actually last year 1% of the FTSE 100 thought the cyber risk was decreasing. Interesting, this year they do not repeat that prediction. So I don't know if that's a bad news for the rest of us, but that's what's going on there. And in terms of transparency, it's quite interesting. Now clearly this is what they're disclosing, not necessarily what they're doing. So many of the FTSE 100 may well be doing this, but they chose not to include it in their annual report, which I think is quite interesting. And what we expect to see over the next few years is every organisation who is doing these things will disclose them, because investors and regulators will start to conclude if you're not disclosing it, that's probably because you're not doing it. Now that isn't true. It's quite possible you can be doing these things and not disclosing them. But I think the pressure to be transparent will only increase. So in the last year, 45% of the FTSE 100 disclosed that their board get at least one report about cyber risk in their organisation during the year. That's up from 39% last year. And 12% say their board have had specific training around cybersecurity. So we touched, I think, in this stream a couple of times on the skills gap, recruiting people. Who knew it wasn't graduates and sort of apprenticeships we should be looking at? It was board members being trained to come and, no, okay. The other key area is in the last couple of years, 20% of the FTSE 100 have disclosed that they've completely reorganized their approach to managing this risk. So that either means there's 20 really good CISO positions open and available for people to be hired to, or 20 people in the room, if you're all FTSE 100, should be a bit nervous, because that trend of the change and focus on this is definitely one we're seeing across the industry. And the final point, just an interesting one around disclosure. Quick show of hands. I'm not going to tie anything back to people, but quick show of hands. Who thinks insider risk is a risk in their organisation? Yeah, interesting. This year, only 23 of the FTSE 100 disclosed that risk from their employees, either inadvertent or deliberate, was a risk they were worried about. That's up from less than 2 a year ago. So the trend is definitely much more around disclosing that. But I think if we are a representative sample, I think we are, I think every member of the FTSE 100 has that risk. So it's quite telling that 3/4 of them are choosing not to disclose it to their investors and their regulators. So I think this trend of transparency is only going to increase. But the question then becomes, how involved are you in making sure that your board are disclosing things that are true? Because I can really assure you, disclosing something, although you might have a choice with doing it, do we want to disclose it or not? If you're disclosing it and not doing it, that is not a happy place to be. So please help your board avoid being in that situation. Nick.
And just a little bit on regulatory focus. So one of the things the financial services regulators globally are getting pretty hot on is red teaming. And there are 2 aspects of that. They are spending a lot of time talking to organisations about what sort of red teaming they do internally, the quality of the red team, how it's staffed, where they get the people from, what their scope is, etc. But there are also a number of external initiatives where the regulators are driving some kind of intelligence-led red teaming against external-facing systems. So, I mean, the Bank of England, the Prudential Regulation Authority in the UK, has really been the pioneer of this. And they've got a scheme that some of you may have come across called CBEST, which we've never worked out what it stands for, but having asked the question a number of times, we're told categorically it definitely does not stand for the Cyber Bank of England stress test. But if anyone knows what it stands for, that would be very helpful. And if everyone thinks that's just a banking thing, it's not, because there'll be a G-best, which is government, and there'll be an N-best, which is nuclear, and there'll be all sorts of other bests that apply to English, UK organisations. Hong Kong, ICAST, intelligence-led cyber attack simulation testing, same sort of thing, and we're seeing some level of collaboration.
Question for you, Nick.
Yes.
The CBES gives your red team intelligence. That's a conflict of interest, isn't it? Between the normal pen test that might not have that intelligence. And you may choose to act on a non-CBES audit, but how would you feel if the first one mandated all that reporting? It was just I get in my head the difference between a normal pen test and a CBES one, where they've got the threat intelligence from the Bank of England.
So we didn't wait for the mic, so I'll just repeat that so everyone else can hear it. Sorry. Please do wait for the mic for the next ones. The question kind of was, CBEST and these other threat intelligence-based approaches, the testing team gets this threat intelligence. So that gives them a sort of unfair advantage, I think, as opposed to a pen test where they might not have that. My understanding of it, I think they're given threat intelligence about the adversaries. So they're told, as a bank, using our government intelligence, we know this organised crime gang is out to get you, and their skills include kidnapping, ninja abseiling from the roof, and flooding the sewers. So the testing team then goes, okay, we need to get ourselves a ninja and a sewer expert so we can recreate the threat. I don't think it's very much around providing them with intelligence about the organisation, other than that, which is already in the public domain.
But
So
that mandated report is the key difference, and they are mandated to report it back to them.
yes, the regulators absolutely want the results of these tests, and I think it's quite an interesting change. Up to this point, there was an awful lot of questionnaires, there was an awful lot of please attest to me, please tell me how well you're doing, and a lot of very regulated organisations are very good at providing that wonderful warm glow, and this approach has gone, yeah, that's great, I love all that stuff you told me, I'm actually going to hire someone independent who's going to tell me the results to have a go at breaking in.
And a step further, the independence piece, the intelligence piece is typically separate from the actual testing piece, and they're both independent organisations, whereas internally you generally expect the red team to be your own people with your own scenarios. Those scenarios are very externally driven in a CBES test or an ICAST test. And then and the scheme which came out yesterday is the Tiber Scheme, so European or Dutch-driven thing, Dutch National Bank-driven thing, but threat intelligence-based ethical red teaming. And for the very small subset of banks who may be not taking some of the other testing schemes quite in the spirit they're intended, there are two interesting features of the Tiber Scheme that have come out. Firstly is it's pretty much stated that you must test live systems, so no longer can you get away with not testing live systems in these tests, which is kind of a feature. And then the second bit of this, which is going to be interesting from my point of view, is it specifically mandates that the board must attest that they have done the Tiber testing in line with the scheme requirements. So 1, live systems, 2, you've got a board who have to sign off that is the case, and you have tested your most critical systems, which I think will step up the focus on these external red teaming exercises to a whole new level. And just the last bit of red teaming is, I mean, there's a regime called Section 166 that the Financial Conduct Authority has, which is basically a skilled persons regime where if they want to go and investigate something in a financial services organisation, they use this to send experts in on, I don't know, liquidity management or client money separation or whatever. And there are 14 or 16 different specialist categories in there. They've just added 4 categories, which are 2 threat intelligence categories and 2 red teaming or ethical hacking type categories. So out of the 14 or 16 categories under the Section 166 now, 4 of them are specifically red teaming or threat intel, which is very new. So I'm expecting to see, if I was having a guess, I would expect to see a materially increased deployment of third parties under regulatory instruction looking at internals of both those aspects over the next 5 years.
So I think in summary, we're seeing customers care about security, we're seeing politicians care about security, we're seeing the media cares about security, and therefore the regulators care about security. And their focus is not just on the sort of traditional cybersecurity in this, but also around privacy and the respect and treatment of these customers. And yes, it's been focused on financial services, and there's definitely a wave of this regulation coming to make sure this part of the critical infrastructure that supports the economy and supports trust and faith of the electorate, that's definitely in the scope. But every other industry, we fully predict these kind of things are going to be coming. So if you're not doing red team testing to give you the assurance that your controls actually work and disclosing that at senior levels within the organisation, the results being good or bad, then you're likely to receive that at some point fairly soon in these other industries. And doing one first that you don't have to mandatedly share with the regulator is probably a wise idea. Thank you very much. Any questions? Come on, I want to throw this at somebody. Even if the question is, why have you thrown that at me? Come on, there's got to be a question. Somebody? Oh, very good. Here we go. Oh. Ouch. Absolutely will not be repeated in the next one, I assure you. Yes, question, sir.
So the point you made about having sufficient resources available to deal with the problem, do you think that's going to drive even harder the need to do outsourcing, managed security, things like that in financial services?
So the DFS certification about sufficient resources does have a carve-out that says that can include third parties. But the problem is nobody's got sufficient resources, in my view, so you sort of have to sign this with a big caveat. So yes, it can include all of those things, and outsourcing and consultants and, but I still think it's a very uncomfortable place to sign to say you have sufficient cyber resources. So, have you spent enough on cyber? Well, it's very, very difficult to tell, and that's kind of okay until you're asked to sign something that says you spent enough on cyber, at which point it gets very nerve-wracking. So,
and I think
there'll be a lot of lawyers involved in doing those attestations in the States.
I think the other thing it'll drive is financial services generally can afford to get sufficient talent, but that's often at the expense of hoovering it out of other industries and other areas. So I think it's one of the ones we draw out. I think it's going to have a knock-on effect. And I think once one industry starts being able to sign off on this, there's a natural question for all the other industries and all the other things. So I think it'll start in FS, but I think it'll spread more widely and only work to make the skills gap even higher. It's not fair that people get to throw things back at you.
So you talked about quantification of risk becoming more of a theme going forward. From my knowledge, and I think it probably goes back further, it's been tried many, many times over at least the last 25 years. And it usually founders on, because they've usually done it in monetary terms, on the non-monetary aspects of risk, which are very difficult to quantify in money terms. How do you see that changing in the next few years?
I think you're absolutely right. It usually founders on the non-monetary aspects of risks. The other component it normally founders on and I can model these risks no problem. Just give me 100 years of cyber attack and actual loss data, and then I'll put it into my models and it'll all be okay. The other piece is not having that data. So I think there's more of that data, and there's more of that data in central organizations with some of the threat intel and sharing architectures. But I think it will run into the fundamental problem that people are going to have to do this, right? I think this is coming. You're going to have to do it. Fundamental problem that, here's a number between, I don't know, 10 million and 40 million, and then I don't think you can get away from there's an overlay with a bunch of smart people saying 25 million feels about right, because there just isn't the data there to do it properly.
I remember how difficult it was to try and get a board of a major bank to quantify reputational risk 20 years ago. So.
I think what exists today there's a much clearer idea of what the categories of risk are and the different loss categories, which didn't 25 years ago.